It was a typical overcast morning in the small town of Derry, Maine. The streets were empty, and only the wind chased fallen leaves along the sidewalks. Jonathan, the local librarian, as always, was walking to work early in the morning. He loved the quiet of the early hours when he could work peacefully without prying eyes. But today, something was off. As he passed by the old abandoned house on the corner of the street, he felt a strange sensation. It wasn't just a premonition or a fleeting shiver. It was something deeper and more troubling. Jonathan stopped and looked around. His gaze fell on the dark window on the second floor. And there, in the depths of the darkness, he saw something, or someone. Jonathan's heart skipped a beat. He couldn't tear his gaze away from the dark spot behind the glass. It seemed absolutely motionless, but at the same time, he felt its gaze upon him. Suddenly, the shadow moved, and Jonathan felt a chill run down his spine. He quickly turned away and hurried to the library, trying not to look back. All day, he couldn't shake the feeling of someone's presence. It was as if someone was watching him from the dark corners, from behind the bookshelves, from under the old tables in the reading room. Jonathan tried to convince himself that it was all just his imagination, but the more he tried to forget, the stronger the sensation became. By evening, when he was closing the library, Jonathan knew one thing: something had changed. And these changes began with that shadow around the corner. Night had fallen on Derry, and with each passing hour, the darkness grew denser. Jonathan lay in his bed, but sleep was not a comfort to him. Thoughts of the shadow he had seen in the morning still swirled in his head. He tried to convince himself that it was just a figment of his imagination, but the more he thought about it, the more real the vision seemed. Suddenly, in the complete silence of the night, he heard a whisper. It was quiet, barely audible, but he was sure it wasn't just the sounds of the house. The whisper sounded as if it were coming from afar, yet at the same time, it seemed to emanate right from the walls of his room. Jonathan sat up in bed and listened. The whisper repeated, as if someone was saying his name. Jonathan, Jonathan. He got up and slowly walked towards the door. The whisper grew louder and more insistent. Jonathan stopped at the corridor door, his hand trembling as he touched the doorknob. He opened the door, and the whisper suddenly stopped. Before him was only a dark, empty corridor. Jonathan moved forward, feeling the walls for a light switch. When the light in the corridor flickered on, he saw that it was absolutely empty. No signs of life, no traces that someone could have been there just seconds ago. He sighed with relief and went back to the bedroom. But when he returned to bed, he noticed something had changed. On his desk, amidst scattered papers and books, lay something new. It was an old black and white photograph depicting the very same abandoned house on the corner. And in the background, in one of the windows, one could make out the same shadow. Jonathan's heart froze. He didn't remember this photograph, and he couldn't understand how it had gotten there. One thing was clear: the shadow around the corner was not just his imagination. It was something much more real and dangerous. The next morning, Jonathan woke up feeling that the night had been restless. A photograph of the old house with a shadow in the window lay on the table, reminding him of unsolved mysteries. With each glance at it, fragments of memories surfaced in his mind, like pieces of a puzzle he couldn't put together. He decided that something had to be done. After breakfast, Jonathan went to the abandoned house. With each step, his heart beat stronger, and thoughts swirled in his head about what he might find there. In daylight, the house looked even more sinister. The old paint was peeling off, the windows were boarded up, and the door was covered with mold and rust. Jonathan cautiously entered inside. The air was heavy and damp, and dust floated in the beams of light piercing through the cracks. He began to inspect the rooms, and in one of them, he found an old photo album. Opening it, Jonathan saw pictures of people he seemed to know but couldn't remember where from. And then he saw a photograph of himself as a little boy, standing in front of this house. In his hands was a toy, an old wooden airplane. Suddenly, memories flooded over him like a wave. He remembered playing here with friends as a child, running through the corridors and hiding in closets. But there was something else, something he still couldn't remember, a dark spot in his memory. Jonathan felt the room grow colder. He looked up and saw that the shadow had appeared again in the doorway. It was dense and dark, and it seemed to be looking right at him. Jonathan froze, unable to move. The shadow slowly approached, and he realized that this was not just a play of light and shadow. It was something alive, and it had come for him. The shadow moved slowly towards Jonathan, and each of its steps echoed in his chest like a hammer. He couldn't move, couldn't scream, he was paralyzed by fear. But then, at the last moment, when the shadow was almost upon him, something inside him awoke. It was the will to live, the instinct of self-preservation that made him act. Jonathan rushed to the window, not thinking of the consequences, and elbowed it out. The glass shattered, and he jumped outside, falling into the bushes below the window. He felt pain, but adrenaline dulled it. He got to his feet and ran, not looking back, across the yard, across the street, away from that cursed place. When he stopped to catch his breath, he realized he was in another part of the city. He looked at his hands, they were bloody and scratched from the glass and bushes. But he was alive, he had escaped. He looked up at the sky and saw that the sun had already risen. His chase had lasted all night. Jonathan knew he couldn't return home. The shadow knew where he lived. He needed help, and the only person he could trust was his old friend, Mary. She was a paranormal researcher and might be able to help him understand what was happening. He headed to her house, still looking back to make sure no one was following him. When he arrived, Mary greeted him with surprise and concern. She saw his condition and immediately let him in. Jonathan told her everything about the shadow, the photograph, the memories that were returning to him. Mary listened attentively, then said she knew the house. It was connected to a series of strange disappearances in the city many years ago. And now, it seemed, Jonathan had become part of that story. They decided they needed to investigate the house again, but this time together. Mary was confident that if they could unravel the mystery of the shadow, they could stop it. But Jonathan felt it would not be easy. The shadow had already shown that it was not just a harmless ghost. It was something much more powerful and sinister. In that night in Derry was unusually quiet. The stars twinkled in the black sky, and the moon lit the streets with a pale light. Jonathan and Mary sat in her living room, discussing their plan of action. They knew they had to be careful. The shadow that pursued Jonathan was dangerous, and they could not predict its next move. Suddenly, in the silence, there was a knock at the door. They both froze. The knock repeated, insistent and loud. Mary stood up and slowly approached the door. Jonathan wanted to stop her, but it was too late. She opened the door, and on the threshold stood a person in a dark cloak with a hood hiding his face. "Sorry to disturb you so late," the stranger began, his voice hoarse and low. "I'm looking for Jonathan. He needs to know the truth about the house on the corner." Jonathan approached the door, feeling his heart pounding in his chest. "Who are you?" he asked. "My name is not important," the stranger replied, "but I know what happens in that house. And I know that the shadow is not just a shadow. It's a spirit, and it's connected to Jonathan much more than he thinks." The stranger extended his hand and handed Jonathan an old book. "This is the history of the house and what happened in it. You need to read this to understand how to stop the shadow." Before Jonathan could ask more questions, the stranger disappeared into the night's darkness. They closed the door and returned to the table where the book lay. They opened it and began to read. With each page, the story became more sinister. It turned out that many years ago, a family lived in that house, and one day they all disappeared without a trace. Since then, the house was considered cursed, and many believed that the spirits of those who disappeared remained there forever. But there was something else, something that connected Jonathan to this house. And now, to unravel this mystery, they had to return there and confront the shadow face to face. After reading the book, Jonathan and Mary understood that the disappearances in the house on the corner were not an isolated case. The story repeated itself over and over, and each time someone disappeared, the shadow grew stronger. They decided to start their investigation by visiting the local archives. There, they hoped to find more information about the house and the people who lived in it. In the archives, they discovered old newspaper clippings that told of strange events in Derry. One article, in particular, caught their attention. It was about a boy named Tommy who vanished without a trace in 1967. He was last seen playing near the house on the corner. The article included a photograph of Tommy, and Jonathan recognized him immediately. It was the same boy he had seen in the old photograph in the house. With each new discovery, it became increasingly clear that the shadow was connected not only to the house but also to the children who played there. Jonathan remembered how he and his friends often played hide and seek in that house as children. He began to suspect that something went wrong during one of those games. Returning to Mary's home, they discussed their findings. They concluded how to stop the shadow. To do that, they needed to find out what happened to Tommy and the other children. But for that, they would have to return to the house and confront its dark past. That night, as they prepared to return to the house, the shadow appeared again. It stood outside the window, watching them. Its presence was a sign that time was running out, and they had to act quickly. The night enveloped Derry, and Jonathan and Mary headed to the house on the corner. They were determined to unravel the mystery of the shadow and the disappearances. Armed with flashlights and a notebook, they entered inside. The house greeted them with an ominous silence and a cold that chilled to the bone. They began their investigation in the basement, where, according to rumors, the story of the disappearances began. Descending the creaking stairs, they felt the air become heavier. The basement was in complete darkness, and only the light from their flashlights cut through it, creating a dance of shadows on the walls. Suddenly, Mary stopped. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. Jonathan listened and heard the faint cry of a child. The sound was so plaintive and sad that it sent shivers down his spine. They followed the sound and found an old toy, a wooden airplane, just like the one Jonathan had in his childhood. When Jonathan took the airplane in his hands, he suddenly felt a strange surge of emotions. Memories of the day he last saw Tommy surfaced in his mind. They were playing in the basement when suddenly Tommy suggested playing a new game, Labyrinth of Fear. It was their own version of hide and seek, where the goal was to find a way out of the basement full of traps and puzzles. Jonathan remembered how they split up and how he heard Tommy scream from another part of the basement. When he found him, Tommy was pale and frightened. He was muttering something about a shadow that was chasing him. After that day, Tommy disappeared, and Jonathan never saw him again. Now, standing in the same basement, Jonathan realized that the shadow was not just a figment of their imagination. It was real, and it had begun its hunt right then. Mary took the airplane and examined it carefully. The name Tommy was engraved on the wing. They understood that this airplane was the key to solving the mystery. They had to use it to pass through the labyrinth of fear and find the place where Tommy last saw the shadow. With this new knowledge and the old toy in hand, they continued their journey into the depths of the house, ready to face whatever awaited them in the darkness. With each step up the stairs to the second floor of the house, Jonathan and Mary felt the air around them becoming denser and heavier. Old photographs looked at them from the walls, like the eyes of ancestors, witnesses to many secrets. They stopped in front of a room that, according to the book, belonged to Tommy. The door creaked open, and they saw a room shrouded in a layer of time's dust. In the center stood a bed with a torn cover, and next to it was an old wardrobe with open doors. Mary approached the wardrobe and found a series of children's drawings. They depicted the house, children, and a dark figure standing in the corner. "It's her," the shadow Mary whispered, pointing at the figure. Jonathan took one of the drawings and examined it closely. He felt memories of Tommy becoming clearer. "Tommy drew this," he said. "He was trying to warn us." Suddenly they heard a rustle behind them. Turning around, they saw the shadow standing in the doorway. It was tall and motionless, and its presence made the air vibrate with tension. Tommy, Jonathan called out softly. The shadow didn't respond but began to move slowly towards them. Jonathan and Mary backed away until they were against the wall. The shadow approached the drawings and pointed to one of them. The drawing showed a labyrinth, and in its center was a bright spot. "That's the place," Jonathan said. "We have to go there." The shadow nodded and disappeared, leaving behind only the echo of the past. Jonathan and Mary understood that this was an invitation. They had to follow the drawing and find the center of the labyrinth to unravel the mystery and free the souls trapped in this house. With the drawing in hand, they descended into the basement, where the labyrinth began. They knew they faced not just a physical obstacle, but a test of their courage and determination. They were ready to confront whatever lay in the depths of the shadow and restore peace to Derry. The basement of the house on the corner was like the beginning of a labyrinth, full of mysteries and dangers. The walls were covered with strange symbols and signs, which Jonathan and Mary understood to indicate the path through the labyrinth. They turned on their flashlights and began their journey, following the drawing they held in their hands. The labyrinth was complex, with many branches and dead ends. But each time they faced a choice, the drawing pointed them in the right direction. They felt the air around them getting colder and the darkness thicker. Suddenly they heard footsteps. The sound was soft, but in this silence it sounded like thunder. They stopped and turned off their flashlights, trying to understand where the sound was coming from. The steps were getting closer, and they realized they were not alone in this labyrinth. The shadow appeared out of the darkness. It was tall and slender, and its eyes glowed in the dark. "You have come," it said in a cold voice. "You have come to learn the truth." Jonathan and Mary didn't move, knowing that any careless movement could cost them their lives. "Who are you?" Jonathan asked. "I am the one who was forgotten," the shadow replied. "I am the one who remained in this house when everyone else left. I am the one who seeks peace." The shadow told them a story about how she was a girl who lived in this house many years ago. She loved to play in the labyrinth that her father built for her in the basement. But one day, during a game, a tragedy occurred, and she was trapped there forever. "Tommy, he was my friend," the shadow continued. "He came to me that day to help me find a way out. But we both got lost, and now I cannot find peace." Jonathan and Mary understood that the shadow was the spirit of the girl, and that she could not leave this world until she found Tommy. They promised to help her, and the shadow pointed them to the center of the labyrinth, where, according to her, was the key to the solution. With new hope in their hearts, they continued their journey. They knew that the hunt was just beginning, and that something greater than just finding a way out of the labyrinth awaited them. They were walking towards their destiny, ready to confront the last secrets of the house on the corner. Jonathan and Mary reached the center of the labyrinth. A small room opened before them, illuminated by the light of candles that created a soft halo around an antique mirror standing in the center. The mirror was covered with the dust of time, but its surface still reflected every beam of light. "This mirror. It has always been here," whispered the shadow, appearing next to them. "This mirror shows not only the reflection but also the souls of those who were here." Jonathan and Mary approached the mirror, and in its depths they saw the reflections of children playing in the labyrinth. Among them was Tommy, his face full of fear and hope. "Tommy," Jonathan called. The boy's reflection in the mirror turned to him. "You can leave. You can find peace." The girl's shadow approached the mirror and placed her hand on its cold surface. The mirror lit up with bright light, and the reflections began to disappear one by one, as if being freed from the shackles of the past. When the light faded, there was no one left in the mirror. The girl's shadow turned to Jonathan and Mary. "Thank you," she said. "Now I can leave. And so can Tommy." With these words, the shadow dissolved into the air, leaving behind only a sense of calm and peace. Jonathan and Mary looked at each other, understanding that their task was completed. They left the house on the corner, which now stood quiet and empty. But within its walls, there was no longer fear and secrets. They had freed the souls that were imprisoned in its darkness, and now these souls had found peace. And although Derry will always be full of mysteries, one of them was solved. Jonathan and Mary knew that their connection to this place would forever remain in their hearts, as a reminder that even in the deepest darkness, one can always find light.